The prairie stretched wide and hollow under the silver sigh of winter, each blade of grass frozen in a lean against the wind. The land, a sheet of old parchment, whispered songs too old for any tongue to name. Above, the stars wept light across a velvet sky, patient and eternal, watching a world too small to notice their sorrow. A cabin hunched low among the hills, its smoke a frail ribbon stitched into the night. It was no grand shelter, just timber stacked against loneliness, but it clung to life stubbornly, like a thorn in the ribs of winter. Inside, the fire cracked and spat, throwing nervous shadows against the walls. A man sat close to its heart, carving at a block of wood with a dull knife, though his eyes stared beyond the blade. His name was Elijah Cutter, born of dust and duty, and though young in years, life had carved its lines deep into his brow. His hair, dark as river mud, curled wild at the edges of his rough-cut coat. His hands, calloused and scarred, were made for hunting, for surviving, not for dreaming. Dreams were a fool's currency in a land that traded only in blood and bone. Elijah had built this cabin with his own 2 hands, each log set with more anger than hope. He had come west because there was nothing left behind him but graves and broken promises. Out here, a man could disappear into the emptiness and become less than a whisper. That suited him fine. He lived by the rule of the rifle and the axe, speaking only when the wind insisted on an answer. The settlers in the nearest town spoke of him in half-shrugs and wary glances, a hunter who had no use for God or company. That, too, suited him fine. But even the hardest men cannot silence the call of the wild when it comes hunting. That night, the wind carried more than the smell of pine and smoke. It carried a sound sharp enough to still a heartbeat, a cry so raw it seemed to tear a hole in the world itself. Elijah froze, knife slipping from his fingers onto the dirt floor. Another howl followed, long and low, and many voices joined it, wolves, starved and reckless under the blood-hungry moon. Elijah rose, grabbing his rifle with the smoothness of habit. He pulled his coat tighter around him, stepped out into the teeth of the cold. His breath rose in ghosts before him, and each step crunched against the brittle ground. He followed the sound, boots sinking into drifts of snow that reached his knees. The prairie was a sea of white now, the hills smoothed over like the back of a sleeping beast. Every shadow could be a snare. Every whisper of movement a promise of death. He found them at the lip of a dry creek bed, the wolves circling something half-buried in the snow. Their bodies slunk low, muscles rippling beneath mangy hides, teeth flashing pale in the moonlight. Without thought, Elijah raised his rifle and fired into the sky. The crack of it shattered the night, sent birds shrieking from bare trees. The wolves flinched, yellow eyes flickering, then scattered into the dark. The thing in the snow did not move. Elijah cursed low under his breath, heart hammering. He slid down the bank, boots sliding on the frozen earth, and knelt by the figure. It was a woman. Her hair, black as raven's wings, was tangled across her face. Her skin, where it showed through the torn remnants of a dress, was a soft brown kissed by the sun that winter had forgotten. Her lips were cracked, trembling. She bled from a gash at her side, the blood too bright against the white. Elijah hesitated. Everything he had been taught screamed in his bones. Navajo. Enemy. Other. But something louder than fear stirred in him, something deeper, like the old songs his mother once sang in the twilight hours before memory turned her face away. He tucked the rifle under one arm, lifted the woman as gently as he could. She weighed less than a sack of grain, her warmth sinking into him even through the layers of wool and leather. She made no sound as he carried her back through the blizzard, only a small breathless hitch when the wind cut cruel. It was the sound of a bird too cold to sing. Inside the cabin, Elijah laid her by the fire, hands moving awkwardly. He peeled off her wet boots, wrapped her in every blanket he owned, stoked the fire high. He heated water, mixed the herbs he had learned to use from an old trapper long dead to the fever. She needed more than he could give. But he gave it anyway. Hours passed in the slow drip of melting ice. Elijah sat watch at her side, rifle within reach, though he could not say if it was to protect her or himself. Her breathing stayed thin, rattling against her ribs like a trapped sparrow. As dawn stretched pale fingers across the horizon, she stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, dark and endless. For a long moment, they stared at each other, Two souls caught on the sharp edge of survival, both too proud to beg for mercy. She tried to sit up. Elijah's hand shot out, steadying her before he even thought. She stiffened under his touch, and he let go, stepping back as if burned. Neither spoke. Words would only muddy what was already a flood between them. Elijah moved to the corner, picking up the rifle, cradling it against his knee. His fingers drummed against the worn wood, mind warring with itself. He could not keep her here. If the town learned he had taken in a Navajo woman, they would come with ropes and torches and righteousness burning hotter than hellfire. They would not ask her name, or why the wolves had hunted her. They would only see skin and history and draw blood to match. He could end it now. A single shot. Quick. Quiet. No one would ever know. He watched her from the corner of his eye. She had pulled the blankets tighter around her shoulders and was staring into the fire, her face unreadable. Not begging. Not pleading. Simply waiting. Elijah gritted his teeth. The fire popped, sending a spray of sparks into the air like tiny stars losing their grip on heaven. He saw his father's face, twisted with hate, hands heavy with the belt. Heard the old man's words slither from memory. You trust an Injun, boy, and you'll be gutted for it. But he also heard another voice, fainter, softer. His brother Samuel, before the fever took him. A heart's a heart, Eli. Don't matter what skin God wrapped it in. Elijah rose slowly, rifle hanging loose in his hand. The woman turned her head, just slightly. A strand of her hair caught the firelight, glowed like a coal. He saw then that she was not some savage ghost come to haunt him. She was a person. Beaten, bloodied, but alive. Clinging to life with a fierceness that shamed him. The rifle slipped from his grasp, landing against the floorboards with a soft thud. He exhaled, a breath he hadn't known he'd been holding. It shook loose something inside him, something old and cracked and aching to heal. Without a word, he crossed to the table, ladled out broth from the pot into a battered tin cup, and set it on the ground near her. She watched him with those fathomless eyes, then, slowly, reached for the cup. Her hands trembled as she lifted it, but she drank. Elijah sank back onto his stool by the fire, rubbing a hand over his face, feeling the stubble scrape against his palm. Outside, the storm began to ease, the world softening into a hush. Inside, something quieter and far more dangerous began to grow. Trust, thin and fragile as spring's first blade of grass. It would not be enough to save them from the world beyond the hills. But it was enough, for now, to save them from each other. And sometimes, that was all a beginning needed. Morning slid across the prairie in soft ribbons of gold, catching on the frost that still clung stubbornly to every blade of grass and crooked fence post. Inside the cabin, the fire had dulled to a low, steady glow, painting the wooden walls in muted amber. The storm had moved on, but it had left its mark, a silence deeper than snow. Elijah Cutter sat stiffly by the hearth, his legs drawn up, his rifle once more resting across his knees. His eyes, red-rimmed from a night without sleep, never left the small figure bundled in his blankets. She had not spoken, had not tried to flee. She simply existed there, in that small pocket of warmth he had carved from the cold. It unsettled him more than any threat might have. He shifted, boots scraping against the floorboards, and she stirred slightly, one hand moving to shield her face from the timid morning light. Her skin, though bruised and battered, held a stubborn beauty, not the delicate beauty of porcelain, but the kind forged by wind and stone and endless sun. Elijah swallowed against the dryness in his throat. His mind battled itself, the old voices warring with the man he was trying, fumblingly, to become. It would be easy, part of him whispered. Easy to end this. No questions. No dangers. But his hands would not obey. The woman sat up slowly, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Her movements were careful, measured. She regarded him, not with fear, but a quiet readiness, as though she had already faced the worst of what men could offer and found herself unbroken. Elijah set the rifle aside, the gesture as loud as a shouted truce. He stood, stretching the stiffness from his limbs, and moved to the stove. The stew he had cooked the night before had thickened into something more solid than liquid, but it was food, and food was something he could offer without stumbling over words. He ladled some into a battered tin plate and placed it on the floor midway between them, then stepped back. She watched him with those unreadable dark eyes, and for a moment he thought she might refuse, might throw it back at him as a statement of her pride. Instead, she inched forward, reaching for the plate with fingers that trembled more from weakness than fear. She ate in small, careful bites, never once looking away from him. Trust, if it existed at all, was still a far-off country. Elijah sat back down, his arms crossed loosely over his chest, studying the fire more than her. The heat prickled his skin but did little to thaw the cold knot coiled beneath his ribs. He needed to think. Keeping her here was a death sentence. The town would not forgive this kindness. They would see only betrayal, only the ancient grudges written into their bloodlines. And yet every fiber of him recoiled from the thought of turning her out, of leaving her to the wolves and the cold and the cruelty of men. His father's voice rose up from the grave, harsh and unyielding. You show mercy to the wrong sort, and you'll pay for it with your blood. But then came another memory, soft as worn leather, Samuel laughing, his hand steady as he mended a broken bird's wing, whispering, "Every life's a prayer, if you listen close enough." The woman finished the food, setting the plate gently back on the floor. She pressed her palms together lightly, in what might have been a thank you or simply a ritual he did not understand. Elijah cleared his throat, uncomfortable in the thickening silence. "You got a name?" he asked, voice rough from disuse. The woman blinked slowly, as if weighing the danger of answering. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and musical, each syllable carefully shaped. "Atsa." The words settled between them, heavier than a stone, lighter than breath. He nodded once, slow and deliberate. It felt like accepting a burden he did not yet know how to carry. He wanted to ask what had happened, why she had been out there alone, bleeding and near death. But questions felt like stones thrown into a fragile glass pond, and he had already cracked enough in her world. Instead, he busied himself with tasks, gathering more firewood, boiling water to clean her wounds properly. He kept his hands busy, though his mind spun in useless circles. As he worked, he became aware of her watching him, not with suspicion, but with something gentler, curiosity, perhaps, or the beginnings of recognition. She did not fear him. Not yet. The realization filled him with a shame so raw he had to turn away, pretending interest in the arrangement of kindling near the hearth. Atsa drifted into uneasy sleep again, her body still weakened by injury and cold. Elijah moved lightly around the cabin, setting things in order. He could not remember the last time he had cared what the place looked like, but now every speck of dirt, every cracked mug seemed like a mark against him. He paused by the window, staring out at the endless white that rolled away from the cabin in all directions. The world out there was cruel and vast and indifferent. He had chosen it because it demanded nothing but survival, because it allowed him to be nothing more than a blade honed sharp by necessity. But now there was a life inside these walls that asked something more. He was not sure he could give it. Night crept in again, the sky deepening into indigo, the stars puncturing the dark like desperate prayers. The wind had died to a whisper, but its absence left the cabin feeling exposed, vulnerable. Elijah sat by the fire once more, his rifle leaning forgotten against the wall. He watched Atsa sleep, the rise and fall of her breath steadier now. He thought about the town, about the men who would ride out with guns and torches if they knew. He thought about the preacher, all stiff black coat and bellowed warnings, and about the widow who had once dared to love a man not approved by the council's cold decree. There was no safety in half-measures. There was no future in fear. He rubbed his hands together slowly, feeling the heat of the fire seep into his cracked skin. Tomorrow he would need to decide. For now, he allowed himself the smallest of mercies, the simple, impossible act of choosing kindness one more time. As he banked the fire low and lay down on the hard-packed earth floor, he found his eyes drawn back to her. Atsa. A name shaped like a prayer he did not yet know how to pray. Sleep came slow, fitful, tangled with dreams he would not remember. When morning came again, it would bring the world with it, suspicion, judgment, choices sharp as knives. But for one night more, under the low roof of his meager shelter, a hunter and a hunted soul shared the fragile, stubborn breath of life. In a land that remembered only the hard and the cruel, it was enough to begin. Days folded over each other like pages worn thin by weather and time. The storm had passed, but its breath still lingered, painting the mornings with a brittle chill and lacing the nights with mist that clung to the window panes like half-forgotten dreams. Inside the cabin, a fragile rhythm began to take root, tentative and cautious as the first green shoot pushing through frost-hardened ground. Atsa moved about the space with quiet purpose, her strength returning in small, stubborn increments. She patched the torn seams of Elijah's coat with thread finer than any he owned, her fingers swift and sure despite the lingering stiffness in her wounded side. She ground herbs into powder and mixed them with snowmelt, creating salves that soothed the burns and blisters Elijah had long since learned to ignore. He watched her from the corner of his eye, unsure if gratitude or guilt weighed heavier on his heart. It shamed him, somehow, to see her tend to the wounds he hadn't noticed piling upon himself. He tried, in his clumsy way, to repay the balance. He carved a new pair of moccasins from deer hide for her, each stitch a silent apology. When she wore them, her steps grew lighter, less pained. She did not thank him aloud, but her glance, soft and brief, was worth more than 1,000 words. They spoke little. Words felt too large, too dangerous. Instead, they traded gestures. A bowl of stew placed closer to her seat by the fire, a folded blanket left where he knew she would find it. Trust was a language of its own, stitched slowly between them. Outside, the world remained hard and suspicious. Elijah traveled to town once a week for supplies, each visit bristling with tension he carried back with him like mud clinging to his boots. The settlers' eyes grew sharper, their greetings colder. Rumors, like seeds on the wind, needed no tending to take root. He told Atsa little of what was said beyond the ridge, but she knew. She read it in the lines carving deeper into his face, in the way his hand lingered near the rifle hanging by the door. Still, she stayed. Still, he built the fire higher each night to drive back the darkness. One evening, as dusk smeared the horizon in bruised violets and soft grays, Atsa sat by the window, weaving strips of leather into a shape Elijah could not name. Her brow was furrowed in concentration, her mouth set in a line of quiet determination. He found himself watching her more often now, not with suspicion, but with a strange, aching fascination. There was a steadiness to her, a rootedness, as if she carried the memory of older mountains and deeper rivers in her blood. She looked up and caught him staring. Instead of looking away, she held his gaze, her eyes calm and unafraid. Something shifted between them, subtle as the turning of a leaf in the breeze. Later, when she handed him the finished piece, a woven charm meant to ward off evil spirits, he recognized the offering for what it was. A bridge. A beginning. He accepted it with both hands, bowing his head in awkward, silent thanks. In the following days, the distance between them lessened. He showed her how to chop wood without splintering the grain, how to set snares for rabbits near the creek's edge. She showed him how to brew tea from pine needles to stave off the sickness that traveled with the cold, how to mend a cracked kettle using river clay. Side by side, they became something more than strangers. Something more dangerous, too, in the eyes of a world that measured belonging by skin and blood. One night, as the fire dwindled into coals, a sound cracked the quiet open, hoofbeats pounding across frozen earth. Elijah was on his feet before thought caught up, rifle in hand, heart slamming against his ribs. Atsa moved silently to his side, her presence steadying him more than any weapon could. Through the warped glass of the window, they saw a lone rider approaching, the horse's breath fuming in the cold like a dragon exhaling. Elijah recognized him before the rider dismounted. Tom Granger, a man whose mouth twisted words into poison with the same ease he twisted rope into nooses. Tom hammered a fist against the door, shouting Elijah's name, voice thick with whiskey and hate. Elijah opened the door a crack, rifle hidden just out of sight. Tom leaned in, the stink of him foul and heavy. "We know what you're hiding, Cutter," he snarled, eyes flicking toward the thin thread of smoke curling from the chimney. "You think you can shelter a redskin and walk among decent folk? Ain't no mercy for traitors." Elijah said nothing, letting silence weigh heavier than any argument. Tom spat into the snow and mounted his horse, leaving behind words sharp as broken glass. "You got a choice, boy. Fix it, or we will." The hoofbeats faded into the night, but their echo stayed lodged deep in Elijah's chest. He closed the door slowly, resting his forehead against the rough wood. Behind him, Atsa stood very still, her face unreadable. He turned to her, the weight of the moment settling like a stone between them. She did not beg. She did not plead. Instead, she gathered her few belongings, the moccasins, the woven charm, a small pouch of herbs, and began to wrap herself in her worn cloak. She was leaving, not because she wanted to, because she would not be the cause of his ruin. Elijah moved without thinking, crossing the room in 3 long strides, catching her hand before she could slip into the night. Her hand was cold and small in his, but she did not pull away. For a long moment, they stood there, suspended between the life he had known and the life he had not yet dared to claim. The fire behind them crackled softly, throwing shadows against the walls. When he spoke, his voice was low, rough with things he could not name. "You don't have to go." Atsa looked up at him, something fierce and fragile burning in her gaze. Slowly, she unwrapped the cloak from her shoulders and let it fall to the floor. She stayed. They did not speak again that night. Words would have only broken the spell, scattered it like startled birds. Instead, they sat by the fire until sleep crept upon them like a soft, inevitable tide. In the days that followed, they prepared. Elijah built stronger shutters for the windows, set traps not just for animals but for men. Atsa taught him how to listen to the wind, to read its warnings hidden beneath its song. The bond between them, once gossamer thin, wove itself tighter with each shared breath, each small, fierce act of defiance. The world beyond their little cabin would not forget them. It would not forgive them. But inside these walls, in the stubborn embers of the cold, they forged something the world could not touch. Something wild. Something sacred. Something worth fighting for. And as another winter storm rolled across the prairie, rattling the windows and howling down the chimney, Elijah and Atsa sat close by the hearth, the firelight dancing across their faces, their hands almost, but not quite, touching. There was still fear. Still danger. Still 1,000 miles of hard road ahead. But there was also this. A beginning. A heartbeat shared against the darkness. And for now, that was enough. The days grew sharper, the light thin and brittle as spun glass. Snow no longer fell gently but scoured the earth, scraping over the cabin's walls like 1,000 desperate fingers. Elijah could feel the world tightening around them, a noose braided from old grudges and fresh suspicion. He rode into town less often now, and when he did, he kept his hat low and his answers lower. The general store, once a place of muted camaraderie, had turned cold, the faces behind the counter stiff with something more dangerous than anger, certainty. The preacher, a man called Reverend Harlan, had begun to preach from his steps rather than his pulpit, thick-voiced with fury, warning of corruption hidden in plain sight, of wolves in human skins, of the rot that kindness would bring. The settlers listened. Fear sharpened them faster than hunger. Elijah kept his purchases brief: salt, flour, lead for the rifle, and left without meeting anyone's gaze. He could feel their eyes on his back, 1,000 pinpricks of judgment trailing him all the way to the edge of town where the widow Allen's house leaned wearily against the endless sky. She was waiting for him this time, a basket in her arms, her thin frame wrapped in a shawl that had once been bright but now hung faded and limp. "Take this," she said without preamble, pressing the basket into his arms. "And be ready." Inside, he found a loaf of bread, a slab of salted meat, a small wrapped bundle of herbs that smelled faintly of safety. Elijah nodded once, the only thanks he trusted himself to give without breaking apart. Widow Allen had once loved a man whose skin did not match hers, and though the town had buried him with hands that looked pious and hearts that burned with hate, she had never bowed her head to them again. Back at the cabin, Atsa met him at the door. Her eyes searched his face, reading the tension there as easily as the tracks left by a passing herd. "They know," he said simply, setting the basket down. She nodded, as if she had expected no other ending. They moved through the days with a new, quiet urgency. Elijah dug a second well closer to the house in case the main one was poisoned. Atsa taught him how to find water hidden beneath certain types of moss, how to gather the bitter roots that would stave off hunger when the stores ran dry. They laid traps not just for the wolves, who grew bolder with each passing night, but for men. Sometimes, when the wind was right, Elijah swore he could hear voices riding its currents, angry, drunken, growing nearer. The nights became longer, the fire burning lower. They slept lightly, fully clothed, boots near at hand, weapons closer. One evening, just as the sun surrendered itself to the coming dark, Elijah found Atsa sitting outside the cabin, facing the horizon. In her lap lay a piece of cloth she had been embroidering, though now her hands lay still. He sat beside her, not speaking. Together, they watched the stars ignite one by one, each a stubborn declaration against the night. "You could leave," she said finally, her voice barely louder than the breeze. "You could say I forced you. You could save yourself." Elijah shook his head slowly. His throat felt too tight for words. She turned to him then, studying his face, searching for cracks in his resolve. There were none. Not any more. That night, as they sat by the fire, Elijah took a battered silver coin from his pocket, a keepsake from his brother, Samuel, polished smooth by years of worry. He handed it to Atsa without ceremony. She looked at it, then at him, understanding flashing between them like a bolt of heat lightning across a summer sky. A promise, unspoken but ironclad. The next day brought a brittle sort of peace, the kind that comes before a storm. Elijah split wood until his shoulders burned, stacking it neatly against the side of the cabin. Atsa smoked meat over the fire, braiding strips of it into ropes that could be carried easily should flight become necessary. Toward midday, the sound of hoofbeats cracked the air wide open. Elijah stiffened, hand instinctively going to the rifle slung over the doorframe. Atsa stood, wiping her hands on her skirt, her body coiled and ready. Through the swirling snow, a group of riders emerged. 5 men, hard-eyed and hunched against the cold. At their head rode Tom Granger, his face twisted in a sneer that spoke of cruelty made personal. Elijah stepped onto the porch, rifle resting against his shoulder, not raised yet, but not idle either. Granger reined his horse to a stop, spitting into the snow. "You had your warning, Cutter," he called, his voice oily with satisfaction. "Ain't no more time for second chances." Behind him, the other men shifted, hands brushing against gun handles, boots tapping nervously against stirrups. Elijah said nothing. Words would only feed the fire. Granger's eyes slid past him, catching sight of Atsa standing just behind the door. "Bring her out," he snarled. "We'll give her a fair trial." Elijah tightened his grip on the rifle. His heart pounded so loud he could barely hear over it, but his hands remained steady. "You come one step closer," he said, his voice low and deadly calm, "and it'll be the last step you take." The riders hesitated. Courage came easier in a mob, but even 5 men could feel the shadow of death when it stretched its fingers toward them. Granger barked a laugh, but it rang hollow in the cold. "You gonna fight all of us for some filthy squaw?" he jeered. Elijah didn't answer with words. He stepped off the porch. The message was clear. Behind him, Atsa moved. She lifted the rifle they had kept ready near the door, cradling it with the ease of long familiarity. Her stance was steady, her aim true. Granger's sneer faltered. For a long moment, the world held its breath. Then, with a string of curses, Granger yanked his horse around. One by one, the riders followed, though their glances backward promised this was not the end. Elijah watched them until they disappeared into the falling snow, until the only sounds left were the whisper of wind through bare branches and the slow, steady drumbeat of his own heart. Inside, he and Atsa stoked the fire higher, setting pots of water to boil, checking the traps and the door latches again. They said little, but their movements were synchronized now, 2 parts of a single, battered whole. Night fell thick and heavy. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, and another answered, and another, until the whole prairie seemed alive with their mourning. Elijah sat near the fire, cleaning his rifle with slow, methodical care. Atsa sat across from him, weaving thin strips of cloth into a bandolier for extra ammunition. Every so often, their eyes would meet across the firelight, and something wordless would pass between them, acknowledgement, gratitude, determination. The storm outside howled its fury, but within these 4 walls, there was only a stubborn, defiant kind of peace. They were no longer waiting to be saved. They were no longer running from fear. They were standing together. By the second nightfall, it was clear the riders were gathering again. Lights flickered on the horizon, torch flames guttering against the dark. The town, it seemed, had decided that righteousness could be bought with blood. Elijah and Atsa prepared as best they could. Boiling water to pour from the windows. Spikes set beneath fresh snow at the foot of the porch. Ropes strung low between trees to unseat riders. Every defense born not of malice, but of necessity. As the first torches appeared at the tree line, Elijah stood at the window, watching them come. Atsa came to stand beside him, slipping her hand into his. Her fingers were small and strong, her grip steady. Whatever came, they would meet it together. The first shot split the night. Elijah answered it. The fight that followed was not clean. It was not noble. It was desperate and ugly and full of the awful, necessary poetry of survival. Granger led the charge and fell first, his horse stumbling over a hidden rope, throwing him hard into the frozen earth. The others faltered, the shock of real resistance slowing their charge. Elijah moved like a man possessed, defending not land, not pride, but a fragile hope he refused to let them crush. Atsa moved with him, her aim sure, her spirit fierce. They fought not to win, but to endure. And when dawn crept gray and shivering over the broken landscape, the riders were gone, their torches quenched, their threats scattered like chaff before the wind. The cabin still stood. They still stood. Bruised. Bloodied. Unbroken. Elijah lowered his rifle, chest heaving, and turned to Atsa. She met his gaze, and in her eyes he saw not the reflection of what they had fought off, but what they had fought for. A life carved not from hate or fear, but from the stubborn, miraculous belief that even in a world turned savage, kindness could still take root. The fire inside the cabin flared and snapped, chasing the chill back into the corners. Outside, the first pale hint of spring touched the edge of the sky. It was not over. It never would be. But as Atsa took his hand in hers and led him back toward the warmth and the waiting light, Elijah knew one unshakable thing. Together, they could weather anything the world dared throw their way. And tomorrow, when the sun rose fully over the battered hills, they would still be here. Still fighting. Still hoping. Still choosing love. The river ran fast with the melt of winter, a rush of cold and life that carved the earth with tireless hands. Its voice filled the morning, a low, ceaseless song that spoke of beginnings and endings, of journeys that would not be denied. Elijah Cutter knelt at its edge, scooping water into his hands, letting it run between his fingers like all the fears he could no longer carry. His reflection shivered in the ripples, a man hardened by survival, softened by something he dared now to call love. Behind him, Atsa moved through the trees, gathering roots and bark, her presence steady as the mountain that cradled the valley in its vast arms. The cabin, battered but unbroken, stood farther up the slope. Smoke curled from its chimney, a thin thread of defiance against the endless sky. It had been a week since the last attack. A week of cautious peace, of wounds tended and silences shared. But Elijah knew the world had not given up so easily. The night before, the widow Allen had come, wrapped in a cloak heavy with rain, her breath white against the darkness. "They're coming," she said simply. "More men. Hired guns. Strangers who don't care what reasons you have, only who pays their wage." Elijah had thanked her with a nod, his voice lost to the roaring in his ears. Atsa had pressed a hand to his chest afterward, feeling the thunder inside him, grounding him with the simple, wordless knowledge that he was not alone. Now, as he rose from the riverbank, water dripping from his fingertips, he felt no panic, only a clear, fierce certainty. He would not run. Not this time. Not ever again. He found Atsa at the edge of the clearing, her arms full of gathered medicine. She smiled faintly when she saw him, the kind of smile that said she understood everything he could not say. They returned to the cabin together, moving easily through the landscape that had become an extension of themselves. Every tree, every hollow, every blade of grass held their memory now. As the sun slipped lower, staining the sky with blood and gold, they prepared. The traps were set again, deeper this time, hidden beneath fallen leaves and loose stones. The narrow path leading up from the river was lined with snares and sharpened stakes. The cabin itself had been reinforced, shutters bolted, doors braced, every gap sealed against the cold and the enemy alike. Inside, the fire burned bright, and the smell of roasting venison filled the air. They sat close but did not touch, their connection beyond the need for constant reassurances now. Trust had woven itself into the very marrow of their bones. Atsa unwrapped a small bundle she had been saving, revealing 2 slender bands of woven leather and beads. She held them out, one in each hand, offering a piece of herself without demand. Elijah took the band she offered him and tied it around his wrist, the beads cool against his skin. Then, with clumsy fingers, he tied the second around hers. No words needed. No promises but the ones they had already made in every breath they took side by side. The night stretched long and restless. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying scents Elijah did not trust: sweat, gun oil, horses. They came just before dawn. There was no warning, no shouted threats or demands for surrender. Only the thunder of hooves and the crack of rifle fire. Elijah was ready. He fired from the upper window, striking the first rider before the man even had a chance to raise his weapon. The horse reared, screaming, and the others hesitated, long enough for Atsa's traps to spring, ropes tightening around legs, stakes rising from hidden pits. The battle was chaos. Gunfire shattered the silence. Horses screamed and men cursed and fell. Smoke choked the air, mixing with the rising mist from the river. Elijah fought like the river itself, relentless, unyielding, carving a path through those who sought to tear his life apart. Atsa moved beside him, quick and sure, reloading, passing ammunition, pulling him back from danger when fury threatened to blind him. They fought not for vengeance, not even for survival. They fought for the life they had built with bare hands and stubborn hope, for every night spent laughing quietly by the fire, for every morning that had begun with the simple, miraculous truth of still being there together. As the sun clawed its way over the horizon, the tide began to turn. The attackers, once so confident, found themselves facing more than a lone man and a wounded woman. They faced a home defended not by walls or weapons, but by something far harder to break. By love. By belonging. One by one, the hired guns fell back, bloodied and beaten, their courage no match for the fierce, unbreakable stand Elijah and Atsa made. The last to flee was a man whose face Elijah did not know, but whose eyes spoke of a life spent taking whatever was weaker than him. Their gazes met across the churned-up snow and broken branches, and for a moment Elijah saw a reflection of what he might have become if he had chosen fear over faith. He did not raise his rifle. He did not need to. The man turned and fled, disappearing into the trees. Silence settled, broken only by the labored breathing of the earth itself. Elijah lowered his rifle, his hands trembling now that the need for violence had passed. Atsa came to him, pressing her forehead against his chest, her arms wrapping around him with a fierceness that nearly buckled his knees. They stood that way for a long time, the fire behind them, the river before them, and the wide, aching sky overhead. Later, they buried the dead with rough prayers and rougher hands, marking each grave with stones so that even those who had come to destroy might not be forgotten entirely. It was not forgiveness. It was simply the recognition that every soul, no matter how lost, had once been a child, had once known hope. When the work was done, they returned to the river. The water ran higher now, fed by the blood and sorrow of the morning, but it still sang its endless song, indifferent and eternal. Atsa knelt by the edge, washing her hands, letting the river carry away the blood and grime. Elijah joined her, his heart a strange, aching thing inside his chest. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the battered silver coin Samuel had given him so many years before. He turned it over in his fingers, feeling the weight of all the roads that had led him here. Then, without ceremony, he tossed it into the river. The coin flashed once in the light, then disappeared into the depths. A letting go. A beginning. Atsa watched him, a small, knowing smile curving her mouth. They sat together on the riverbank, the sun warm against their backs, the wounds of the morning already beginning to knit themselves into the tapestry of their shared life. There would be more battles. More storms. The world would not change simply because two people dared to love in defiance of its cruelty. But within the walls of their cabin, on the banks of this river, in the shadow of this mountain, they had carved out a place that was theirs alone. A place where the past could not chain them. A place where the future, however uncertain, belonged to them and them alone. As the day faded into gold and lavender, they built a small fire by the water's edge. They cooked what little food they had, shared it without ceremony, and spoke in low voices about plans for the spring. Planting a garden, mending the roof, perhaps finding a way to trade with the distant Navajo settlements if peace could be brokered. Simple dreams. Radical dreams. Dreams made sacred by the blood and hope that had watered them. Night fell soft and velvet across the land. The stars woke slowly, blinking into existence one by one. Elijah lay back on the grass, his arm outstretched, his fingers brushing adzes where she lay beside him. They watched the sky together, breathing in rhythm, two small figures stubborn against the infinite vastness. After a long, comfortable silence, Elijah spoke. I used to think this world only knew how to take. Atsa turned her head toward him, her eyes reflecting the starlight. And now? She asked, voice barely more than a breath. He smiled, slow and sure. Now I know it can give back, he said, if you're brave enough to hold on. Atsa laced her fingers through his, anchoring him to the earth, to the sky, to the wild, beautiful ache of living. The river sang on. The mountain watched. And somewhere in the wide, listening darkness, the world shifted, just a little, to make room for two souls who had chosen, against every odd, to believe in the stubborn, breathtaking miracle of love. The sky above Dry Creek bled the last of the day's color into the west, a soft sorrow of purples and golds folding into blue. A single stagecoach rolled through the dust, its wheels moaning like tired spirits, cutting twin scars into the dry earth. Inside, a woman sat straight-backed and still, her gloved hands clasped tightly around a worn leather satchel pressed against her chest as though it held her very heartbeat. Her name was Martha Mayfield, and she had traveled 1,000 miles in Hope's frail carriage. She wore a faded green dress that had once belonged to her mother and a bonnet that shaded her face, though not enough to hide the strong set of her jaw or the coppery hue of her sun-kissed skin. Her figure was broad, a body built more for carrying burdens than for dancing in parlors, but her eyes held the whole fierce, tender country inside them. The coach rattled over a creek bed and Martha closed her eyes, remembering the letter that had summoned her to this hard little town stitched against the wilds. Mr. Jacob Thorne, rancher of some repute, seeking a wife of sturdy constitution and good Christian morals. Her heart had leapt when she read it, desperate for a future beyond the threadbare loneliness of her existence. She had answered honestly, speaking of her love for baking, her talent with horses, her dreams of a home with laughter stitched into its seams. Weeks later, a return letter came, brief and practical. He had accepted her offer. No sweet words. No promises. Just a place to go, a person to belong to. It was enough. As the town appeared, a scatter of buildings clinging to the earth like stubborn weeds, Martha straightened her shoulders. She pressed a hand to her bonnet, feeling the braided plait of her hair pinned tight underneath. She thought of her father's words, long ago when the world was young and her heart was wide open. You are enough, little bird. The world just don't always see it right away. The coach shuddered to a stop. Dust whirled around the wheels, and the driver tipped his hat without looking her in the eye. Martha climbed down slowly, skirts catching against the rough wood, boots touching the cracked earth like a prayer whispered to a doubtful sky. There were faces at the station, not many, but enough. A gaggle of boys in dirty suspenders. A shopkeeper wiping his hands on an apron. A stern-faced woman with a baby slung on her hip. All of them stared as Martha stood there, clutching her satchel, trying to draw breath into lungs that seemed suddenly too small. He was supposed to meet her. Mr. Thorne. She had worn her best dress for this moment, had rubbed her shoes with lard to shine them, had brushed her thick hair until it gleamed. From the far side of the platform, a man approached. He wore a brown hat pulled low, and a jacket that hung on him like tired skin. His boots scuffed the boards with every step, raising little puffs of dust. As he drew closer, Martha could see the tightness in his mouth, the set of his narrow eyes, how they darted up and down her frame with a flicker of something not kind. Jacob Thorne, the man she had promised her life to in ink and hope. He stopped 2 paces from her, looking her over with a sneer half hidden beneath a mustache too thin to bother with. "You're Martha," he said, voice sharp as a snapped twig. "I am," Martha said, steady despite the tremble in her belly. Jacob shifted, spat into the dirt. His gaze traveled from the roundness of her arms to the fullness of her hips, to the flush of her skin that no bonnet could disguise. His lip curled. "You didn't mention you was." He gestured vaguely, distaste dripping from his words. "Big-boned." The murmurs from the crowd sharpened. Martha felt every glance like nettles against her skin. "I said I was of hearty stock," she replied, voice low, careful. He snorted, a bitter sound. "And you sure as hell didn't say you was red. Damn near half Injun by the look of you." A flicker of pain, old and familiar, lanced through Martha. She thought of her mother's dark braids, her laughter like bells in the prairie wind. She thought of the shame her father had worn like a second skin after marrying her. Martha set her satchel down slowly. The weight of every mile traveled, every dream spun during sleepless nights, pressed against her chest until it was hard to stand straight. Still, she did. "I came here in good faith," she said, her voice trembling but true. "You answered my letter." "I ain't gonna marry some overfed half-breed," Jacob said, loud enough for everyone to hear. The words struck harder than fists. A wash of shame, hot and thick, crawled up Martha's neck, but she did not cry. She would not give them that. The station seemed to hold its breath. Even the wind stilled. For a long, endless moment, Martha simply stood there, hands at her sides, feeling the brittle threads of her future unravel around her feet. Then she bent, picked up her satchel, and without a word, turned away. The crowd parted like water around a stone as she walked. She kept her head high, though every step was a small agony. Each boot fall thudded in her ears louder than any jeer or whisper. The inn was a squat building at the end of the street, its windows dusty and cracked. Martha made her way there, heart hammering so loud she was sure it must echo off the worn boards. She climbed the steps slowly, her body heavy with all the miles and all the hurts that had come before and would come after. A small woman stood in the doorway, flour dust smudging her apron. Her gray hair was pulled into a tight bun, and her eyes were soft with a pity that Martha could not bear. "You need a room, dear?" the woman asked, her voice a worn quilt of kindness. Martha nodded. "I'm Mrs. Abernathy. You come on in. Got a room upstairs, clean enough." The warmth of that simple offer cracked something inside Martha, but she swallowed the ache. She followed Mrs. Abernathy into the dim coolness of the inn, letting the door swing shut behind her like the closing of an old chapter. In the small upstairs room, Martha set her satchel down carefully. She peeled off her gloves, feeling the heat of her skin against the coldness of defeat. She sat on the narrow bed, hands limp in her lap, and stared out the window at the sprawling, indifferent land beyond. How foolish she had been to believe in letters, in promises, in anything at all. The sun dipped lower, setting fire to the edges of the clouds. Shadows stretched long and lean across the dirt streets. Below, in the fading light, Martha saw Mr. Thorne walking away with a swagger, laughing with the shopkeeper. She watched the people of Dry Creek returning to their lives, brushing her existence away like an unwelcome fly. Tears welled, but she blinked them back fiercely. She had not crossed deserts, rivers, and broken dreams just to crumple now. She would not let these small-minded souls break her spirit. Somewhere deep inside her, a new, hard thread stitched itself into the fabric of her being. She would endure. She would survive. And one day, somehow, she would thrive. Outside, the last of the light died, and night swept over the town like a weary sigh. Martha lit the single oil lamp by the bed. The flame sputtered, caught, and burned steady, casting long shadows against the walls. She sat back against the pillows, staring into the soft golden glow, and thought, tomorrow is another day. And so am I. Far across town, unnoticed by her yet, another pair of eyes had watched the stage arrive. Eyes that saw not shame or flaw, but strength. Not burden, but beauty. But that was another story, waiting just beyond the next sunrise. Morning broke soft and slow over Dry Creek, the sky the color of worn linen, pale and stretched thin by the coming heat. Martha Mayfield sat by the window of the small inn room, watching the day stir itself into being. Down below, the townsfolk moved like ants in the dust, purposeful and small. Wagons creaked past. A dog barked once, sharp and lonely. Her hands rested on the worn wood of the windowsill, nails bitten short, knuckles pale from the tension she did not let show. She had not slept much. Dreams had come and gone like restless ghosts, each one leaving a hollow ache in its wake. Still, the sun rose, and so did she. Downstairs, Mrs. Abernathy greeted her with a smile stitched from duty and kindness both. A plate of eggs and a heel of bread waited on the table. Martha ate mechanically, the food turning to clay in her mouth. When she finished, she dusted her skirts and stepped out into the morning, head held high. There was no place else to go but forward. The streets of Dry Creek felt sharper today, as if the dust itself carried whispers. Eyes lingered longer than courtesy allowed. Murmured words drifted behind her like smoke, too low to catch, but heavy enough to feel. Martha walked with even steps, refusing to hurry, refusing to hide. She needed to speak to Jacob Thorne. Not to plead, not to beg, simply to finish what had begun. She found him outside the feed store, boot propped against a barrel, toothpick dancing between his teeth. A few men stood nearby, laughing too loud, glancing too often her way. Jacob's face tightened when he saw her approach, as if her mere presence was an offense. "Mr. Thorne," she said, voice calm, though her heart knocked against her ribs like a trapped bird. He pushed off the barrel lazily, squinting at her under the brim of his battered hat. "Come to make a scene," he drawled. "No," Martha said. "Only to understand." Jacob laughed, a mean hollow sound that bounced off the sun-baked walls. His companion smirked but said nothing. "Understand what, girl? I ain't marrying you. That's plain." Martha kept her gaze steady, though her throat burned with unshed fury. "You sent for me," she said. "You agreed." He spat into the dirt, shrugged. "Didn't know what I was getting. Thought I was getting a real woman, not—" He let the sentence hang in the air, poisonous and unfinished. The men chuckled under their breath. Martha stood very still, the way one might stand before a striking snake, refusing to flinch. "You ain't what a man wants on his arm," Jacob continued, voice loud enough to carry. "You're big enough to plow fields with your own 2 hands. And that skin," he sneered openly now. "Folk'll think I married a squaw." The words hit harder than fists. For one long, raw moment, Martha wanted to shrink, to vanish into the cracked earth beneath her boots. But pride rose up like wildfire, fierce and hungry. She took a slow breath. The air tasted of dust and bitterness. "I am not ashamed of who I am," she said, each word shaped carefully, like a knife sharpened on stone. "And one day you'll wish you had been half the man you pretend to be." A ripple of silence spread through the street. Jacob opened his mouth to retort but found no words. Martha turned on her heel, skirts swirling around her legs, and walked away without looking back. Behind her, laughter faltered. Whispers died on tongues. The morning sun bore witness, casting long shadows behind her as she made her way down the street. At the far end of town, Martha paused, gathering herself. Her legs shook from the effort of holding everything in, the humiliation, the rage, the sorrow, but she would not fall. Not where they could see. Instead, she made her way to the small church perched atop a low hill. Its white paint peeled like sunburned skin, and the bell above the door leaned precariously in its frame. Inside, the air was cool and still, heavy with the scent of old wood and dust and faded hope. She knelt at the front, not to pray, not yet, but simply to breathe. Footsteps approached softly. Martha lifted her head to see Reverend Holt standing there, his black coat buttoned to the throat despite the heat, his hands folded solemnly in front of him. "You are welcome here," he said, voice gentle but distant. Martha nodded, words thick in her throat. Reverend Holt hesitated, then added, almost apologetically, "Dry Creek is a small place. Folks can be unkind to what they don't understand." "I don't need their understanding," Martha said quietly. "Only their distance." A shadow crossed the Reverend's face, but he said no more, simply inclining his head before retreating into the deeper gloom of the church. Martha sat for a long while, the silence a balm and a burden both. She thought of her mother, who had taught her to braid hair and ride bareback before teaching her letters. She thought of her father, who had worn shame on his face whenever they went into town. She thought of the endless road that had led her here, a road paved with hope and longing and stubbornness. She would not turn back now. That evening, Martha returned to the inn. Mrs. Abernathy greeted her with a fresh pot of coffee and a plate of stew so fragrant it made Martha's stomach clench with hunger despite everything. The old woman said nothing of what had happened. She only pressed a hand lightly to Martha's shoulder as she passed, a small, fierce kindness that nearly undid her. After supper, Martha sat in the rocking chair by the fire, sewing a tear in her only good dress. The lamplight flickered, throwing shadows across the room. Her fingers moved steadily, threading needle through cloth, pulling each stitch tight as if sewing her heart back together, piece by stubborn piece. Outside, the night stretched wide and deep. Stars winked into existence, each one a tiny fire against the vast darkness. Martha thought of the town, of Jacob Thorne, of the whispered slurs that had clung to her since childhood. She thought of all the places she might have gone instead, of all the lives she might have lived if only the world had been kinder. But regret was a poison she refused to drink. She would not be small to make others comfortable. She would not be silent to ease their guilt. She would not be ashamed to soothe their prejudice. She was here. She was alive. And she would find a way to build a life worth living, even if she had to carve it from the very stone of this unforgiving land. The fire crackled low. Mrs. Abernathy dozed in her chair, head nodding, breath soft and even. Martha finished the last stitch, bit off the thread, and folded the mended dress across her lap. She leaned back, letting the slow rhythm of the rocker lull her. The creak and groan of old would a kind of lullaby. Tomorrow would come, and she would meet it standing. Somewhere in the hush of the night, Martha felt a thread of something new stirring in her chest. Not hope, not yet. Hope was a delicate thing, and she was still too raw, too wary. No, it was something stronger, deeper. Resilience. The unbreakable thread that ties the soul to the body when all else is lost. She closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the fire seep into her bones. Letting the slow, steady beat of her heart remind her that she was not finished. Not by a long shot. Out there, beyond the edge of town, the land stretched on forever, wild and open and waiting. And somewhere in all that wide country, Martha knew, there had to be a place where she would be seen not as a burden or a blemish, but as something rare and beautiful and whole. She just had to keep walking until she found it. The night deepened. The fire burned low. And Martha Mayfield, mail-order bride rejected and scorned, slept with a quiet determination curled inside her like an ember, waiting for the wind to come. The morning after the fire burned low and the dreams burned lower still, Martha Mayfield woke to the sound of hammers singing in the distance. It was a sharp rhythm, steady and sure, a sound that somehow filled the empty corners of the town with something more alive than gossip and dust. She rose slowly, washing her face with cold water from the porcelain basin, tying her hair back in a thick braid. Her dress hung clean and mended from the night before, and she wore it like armor, buttoning each cuff and collar with deliberate hands. She tucked her satchel beneath her arm, though there was little inside worth stealing, and set out into the day. Dry Creek bustled in its thin, desolate way. Wagons rattled past, chickens scratched at hard-packed dirt, and the sun climbed relentlessly toward its noon throne. Martha walked with quiet purpose, letting the stares of townsfolk slip from her skin like water from a duck's back. She had errands to run, small necessities that made life feel less adrift. It was the broken latch on her satchel that took her to the blacksmith. The forge sat at the edge of town, half shaded by an old sycamore that looked as though it might crumble in the next hard wind. Smoke puffed from the chimney in slow, lazy coils. The door hung open, and inside, the clang of hammer against anvil echoed like a heartbeat. Martha hesitated at the threshold, feeling the old nervousness stir in her chest. She almost turned back, almost let the broken latch remain broken, as so many things in her life had been left, unfinished, unhealed, untended. But something, stubborn and sharp, pressed her forward. The blacksmith stood at the anvil, back to her, the muscles across his shoulders moving with each measured strike. He was a tall man, broad and spare, built like the land itself, not decorative but enduring. His hair was dark, curling slightly at the ends where the heat had sweated it loose from its tie. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow, revealing arms dusted with soot and strength. He did not notice her right away. Martha cleared her throat softly. The blacksmith set down his hammer with a grace that belied its weight and turned. His face was plain in the best sense, honest, solid, unhurried by vanity. His eyes, dark as creaked stones, met hers without flinching, without wandering, without judgment. It struck her like a sudden cooling breeze, the way he looked at her, as if she were simply a person, not a curiosity, not a mistake. "Morning, ma'am," he said, voice deep and low, carrying the cadence of someone who spoke little but meant every word. "What can I do for you?" Martha held out her satchel. The clasp dangled by a thin thread of leather. "My latch broke," she said, feeling foolish. "I thought perhaps, if it's not too much trouble." The blacksmith took the bag gently from her hands, turning it over in his large, capable fingers. He examined it as one might examine a foal's lame leg, with care, with attention. "Not much trouble at all," he said simply. He moved to a workbench cluttered with tools and scraps of iron, setting to work with quiet efficiency. Martha watched, her hands twisting themselves together in the folds of her skirt. There was something about the way he moved, no wasted gestures, no needless noise. The world seemed to narrow to the tap of his tools, the slight furrow of his brow, the steady rise and fall of his breath. When he finished, he tested the latch with a soft click, then looked up at her, offering the satchel back like a small, mended thing between them. "Good as new," he said. Martha took it carefully, feeling the smooth strength of the repaired clasp beneath her fingers. "Thank you," she said, and meant it with a fullness that surprised her. The blacksmith nodded, almost shyly. "Name's Elias Boone," he said after a pause, as if it mattered to him that she knew. "Martha Mayfield," she replied. A small, awkward beat of silence stretched between them. Elias shifted his weight, a motion so unguarded that Martha found herself smiling, a real smile, brief and trembling, but real. "If you need anything else mended," he said, "I'm usually here." "I'll keep that in mind," she said softly. She turned to go, but at the door, something tugged at her heart like a child pulling at a mother's skirts. She looked back. Elias had already returned to his anvil, but he glanced up as if he had felt her looking. Their eyes met again, not with heat, not with hunger, but with something deeper. Recognition, perhaps, or the first pale seed of it. Martha stepped out into the sunlight, the repaired satchel warm against her side. The day felt a shade less heavy. Over the next week, their paths crossed again and again, as if the town itself conspired to place them in each other's way. At the market, where Martha struggled with a sack of flour too large for her arms alone, Elias appeared beside her, wordless, lifting it with ease and walking it to the inn without waiting for thanks. At the well, where her bucket's rope snapped clean and he tied it back with a knot sure enough to hold through a dozen storms. Each encounter was small, barely more than a nod or a murmured word. Yet each left a mark, soft and unseen, on the shape of her days. The town noticed, of course. Dry Creek was too small, too starved for novelty to miss even the smallest shift. Whispers sprouted in the dusty alleys and behind curtained windows. The blacksmith and the rejected bride. Poor Elias, saddling himself with the town's charity case. But if Elias heard, he gave no sign. His gaze remained steady, his hand steady, his presence like a stone set deep into the riverbed, unmoved by the current, unmoved by the noise. One evening, as the sun bled out into a sea of orange and gold, Martha found herself sitting outside the inn, a mending basket at her feet. The air smelled of smoke and baking bread, and somewhere a fiddle sang a lonely tune. Elias walked by, hat in hand, looking as though he might pass her by with a polite nod. Instead, he stopped. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. Martha gestured to the empty step beside her. He lowered himself down carefully, as if afraid of breaking something delicate. For a long while, they sat in easy silence, watching the sky swallow the sun. "You like it here?" he asked at last, voice roughened by disuse but gentle beneath. Martha considered the question. "It's different than I expected," she said honestly. "Harder. Lonelier." Elias nodded, as if he understood too well. Hard places can make strong things, he said. Martha turned to look at him, studying the lines of his face, the way the fading light touched the worn softness around his eyes. Or break them, she said quietly. Maybe both, he said, and there was no sadness in it, only truth. She found herself smiling again, that rare, shy thing. They sat until the stars kindled themselves into being, one after another, until the sky was a field of silver fire. When Elias stood, he touched the brim of his hat in a gesture so old-fashioned and sincere it nearly unraveled her. "Good night, Miss Mayfield. Good night, Mr. Boone." As he walked away, Martha felt the first faint stirring of something she had thought long dead. Not love, not yet, but trust. A tiny, stubborn root digging itself into the cracked soil of her heart. The next morning, she would find a small package left at the inn's door, a loaf of bread, still warm, and a jar of peach preserves. No note. No need for one. Kindness spoke in actions here, not words. And as Martha closed her hand around the simple gift, she realized she was no longer merely surviving. She was beginning, piece by careful piece, to live. The days wore on with the steady, grinding rhythm of a wagon wheel over stone. Martha Mayfield found herself stitched into the quiet pattern of Dry Creek life, her days filled with small labors and smaller triumphs. Yet beneath the surface, tension simmered like a pot left too long over flame. The townsfolk had never been good at minding their own affairs. Whispers bred like flies in the heat, buzzing from ear to ear until the very air seemed thick with them. It was not enough that Martha had been rejected publicly. Now every kindness shown to her became another thing for tongues to gnaw at. Elias Boone had become a subject of those whispers. At first, it was mild curiosity. A glance here, a raised brow there. But as the weeks drew on, and as Elias continued to offer quiet support, fixing her broken porch step without being asked, leaving small bundles of firewood at her door, the murmurs grew sharper, meaner. Poor Elias, taking pity on the fat squaw. He'll ruin his good name. She'll bleed him dry. Martha heard the words, carried to her by chance snatches of conversation, by the stiffening of shoulders when she entered a room, by the heavy silence that followed her like a second shadow. She bore it as she had always borne cruelty, with a brittle sort of grace, but something inside her began to fray at the edges. It wasn't pity she wanted. It wasn't obligation. She wanted to be chosen. Freely. Fiercely. Each kindness Elias offered, though tender and genuine, became harder for Martha to accept. Doubts, old as her bones, woke from their restless slumber and whispered ugly truths into her ear. He is only sorry for you. He could have anyone. Why would he choose you? She tried to keep her distance, to pull herself back before the hope blooming in her chest grew too wild, too reckless. Yet even in this, Elias was steady. He did not push, did not demand, did not expect. He was simply there, a quiet, unshakable presence in a world that had never stopped trying to shove her aside. One afternoon, as summer pressed heavy against the town like a hand over its mouth, Martha found herself standing at the well, drawing water with slow, mechanical motions. Her thoughts churned darker than the bucket swinging at the end of the rope. Footsteps scuffed against the dust behind her. She turned to find two women from the town, Mrs. Barrow and Miss Simmons, both sharp-eyed and sharper-tongued, pretending to busy themselves with bundles of herbs. They offered tight smiles, brittle and false. "Good afternoon, Miss Mayfield," Mrs. Barrow said, voice too sweet. "Fine day, isn't it?" added Miss Simmons, though her gaze slid away from Martha as if she were something unpleasant on the sole of her boot. Martha inclined her head politely, not trusting herself to speak. A beat of silence, heavy and pointed. "You and Mr. Boone seem to be friendly," Mrs. Barrow said at last, twisting the word into something ugly. Martha's spine straightened. Her hands did not tremble, though her heart did. "We are neighbors," she said coolly. "Neighbors help one another." Miss Simmons tittered, a high, mean sound. "Of course," she said. "But folks talk, you know. A man like Elias. Well, he ought to be more careful. Tainting his reputation, getting mixed up with." Mrs. Barrow placed a hand on Miss Simmons's arm, a delicate, practiced interruption. As if to say, not here, not yet. Martha gathered her skirts and turned away without another word. She would not stand there and be dissected like a carcass left too long under the sun. The bucket clanged against the side of the well, water sloshing over the edge. She gripped the rope until her palms ached, willing herself not to look back, not to cry. That night, the sky grew restless. Clouds boiled on the horizon, dark and bruised, and the air turned sharp with the scent of coming rain. Thunder rumbled low, a promise of fury yet to fall. Martha sat on the narrow porch of the inn, mending a ripped sleeve, though the light was too poor and her fingers too clumsy to do much good. Her thoughts twisted in circles, each darker than the last. She could leave. Pack her satchel, take the next stage out of Dry Creek, vanish into the long, lonely road she knew so well. It would hurt. God, it would tear her in two, but it would be easier than staying, easier than hoping. Hope was a razor that cut deeper than hate. The first fat drops of rain splattered against the ground, darkening the dust to mud. Wind tugged at her braid, pulled at the mending in her lap. The storm broke with a violence that startled her from her thoughts. Lightning tore the sky open, thunder chasing close behind. Rain fell in sheets, pounding against the roof, hammering the world into submission. She scrambled to gather her things, but the wind caught the sleeve she had been sewing, sending it flying into the darkness. Martha cursed under her breath, shoving her sewing into a basket, retreating into the safety of the inn's doorway. A figure emerged from the downpour, moving against the wind with grim determination. Elias Boone. He strode up the steps 2 at a time, rain streaming from the brim of his hat, soaking his shirt until it clung to the strong lines of his frame. Without a word, he reached out, took the basket from her hands, and ushered her inside. The inn was empty save for Mrs. Abernathy, who peered at them over the rim of her knitting, one gray brow arched in silent approval. Martha stood dripping in the entryway, heart pounding in her ears louder than the storm. "You can't be out in this," she said, more accusation than gratitude. Elias set the basket down carefully, his hands lingering for a moment longer than necessary. "You shouldn't be alone in a storm like this," he said simply. The room felt too small, the air too thick. "You don't have to look after me," she said, the words slipping out sharp and raw. "I'm not your burden." Elias's brow furrowed, a frown of confusion and something deeper, hurt, maybe. "I don't see you that way," he said. "Then how do you see me?" she asked, voice low, trembling. The storm howled against the windows. Thunder shook the floor beneath their feet. Elias stepped closer, slow and deliberate, as if giving her every chance to retreat. "I see a woman who deserves more than this town's small minds," he said. "More than the lies they tell. More than she's been given." Martha's throat tightened painfully. "Why?" she whispered. "Why me?" Elias looked at her as if the question itself was a wound he could not heal. "Because you're strong," he said. "Because you're kind. Because you don't hide from who you are, even when it would be easier." He lifted a hand, hesitated, then gently brushed a strand of wet hair from her cheek. "Because when you smile," he said, so softly she almost didn't hear it, "it feels like the sun rising." Tears welled in Martha's eyes, hot and helpless. No one had ever spoken to her like that. Not her father, who had loved her with apologies tucked into every embrace. Not the boys back home, who had wanted her in secret but scorned her in daylight. Not Jacob Thorne, who had weighed her worth against the narrow measure of his own vanity and found her lacking. Only Elias. Only this quiet, steady man who asked for nothing but gave everything. The storm raged on outside, but inside, the world narrowed to the space between them. Martha closed the distance, resting her forehead against his chest. His arms came around her without hesitation, strong and sure, anchoring her against the rising tide of doubt. They stood that way for a long time, two souls battered but unbroken, sheltering each other against a world too often cruel. When the rain finally slowed to a gentle patter, when the thunder rolled away into the distant hills, Martha lifted her head. Elias's eyes met hers, full of something fierce and tender. "You're not alone, Martha Mayfield," he said. Not anymore. The words settled into her heart like seeds into fertile ground. She believed him. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe. Later, when the fire crackled low and the night pressed soft and damp against the windows, Martha sat with Elias in the common room of the inn. They spoke little, but words were not needed. Their presence was enough, a quiet symphony of breath and heartbeat and belonging. Mrs. Abernathy brought them mugs of cider, her eyes twinkling with something like satisfaction, and left them to their silence. Outside, the stars began to pierce the thinning clouds, shy and tentative at first, then bolder. Martha sipped her cider, feeling the warmth bloom in her chest. The town would talk. They would sneer and whisper and judge. Let them. She had survived worse than their spite. She had found something stronger than their hate. She had found, at last, the beginning of something worth fighting for. And she would fight for it with every breath in her body. The storm had come. It had torn at the walls of her life, rattled the foundations of her hope. But she was still standing. And in the wreckage, in the mud and the broken branches, she had found something shining and stubborn and true. She had found Elias Boone. The night stretched on, soft and endless, carrying with it the quiet promise of a new dawn. And for the first time in a long time, Martha Mayfield dared to believe that the sunrise would belong to her too. The bell above Dry Creek's small church tolled slow and somber, each clang cutting through the morning mist like a warning. The town gathered in ones and twos, drawn not by faith today but by the thick, eager pull of scandal. Whispers traveled ahead of them, weaving a net of judgment through the pews before a single hymn could be sung. Martha Mayfield stood before the cracked mirror in her room at the inn, fingers trembling as she pinned her hair into a simple coil. Her best dress lay smoothed across her body like armor, the stitches from her own careful hand tight and strong. She studied herself as if she might find answers in the curve of her cheek, the firm set of her mouth. She saw the broadness of her shoulders, the redness of her skin, the stubborn defiance in her eyes. She breathed deeply, feeling the tightness in her chest loosen just enough to move. There had been no formal invitation to the gathering, but the message had been clear as any sermon. A reckoning was expected. The town demanded its spectacle, its public cleansing. The whispers about her and Elias Boone had festered into something uglier, something desperate. It was not enough for them to wound her with glances and muttered words. They needed to see her broken. They needed her shame to be visible, to be official. Mrs. Abernathy pressed a shawl into Martha's hands before she left, her gnarled fingers lingering in silent blessing. Martha draped it over her shoulders, grateful for the weight of it, for the reminder that she was not entirely alone. The church loomed at the top of the hill, whitewashed walls peeling under the relentless sun, the steps worn smooth by generations of wary feet. Martha climbed them slowly, the hem of her dress catching against the splinters. She paused at the door, heart hammering, and pushed it open. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and resentment. Heads turned as she entered, a ripple of silence rolling from pew to pew. Reverend Holt stood at the pulpit, his face grave beneath the weight of his office. He watched her approach, eyes unreadable, and gestured silently to an empty bench near the front. Martha moved through the sea of narrowed eyes and tight mouths, each step a battle against the trembling in her knees. She sat, folding her hands neatly in her lap, and stared straight ahead, refusing to let them see her break. The service began, a thin, joyless thing, words falling flat against the cracked wood and sagging beams. Hymns were sung half-heartedly, prayers mumbled without conviction. It was not worship that filled the church that day, but something colder, more calculating. When the last amen faded into uncomfortable silence, Reverend Holt cleared his throat and stepped forward. "There are matters," he began, voice dry and brittle, "that weigh heavy upon the heart of this community." Murmurs of agreement slithered through the pews. "We are a people who believe in decency, in propriety," he continued, eyes flickering toward Martha without directly meeting hers. "And when the actions of individuals threaten the moral fabric of our town, it is our duty to address them." Martha sat very still, feeling the heat of every gaze burn against her skin. "Elias Boone," Reverend Holt said, voice tightening, "has engaged in conduct unbecoming of a Christian gentleman. In his dealings with Miss Martha Mayfield." The door swung open with a force that rattled the windows. Elias Boone stood in the doorway, the morning light framing him like a halo, though there was nothing saintly about the way he held himself. His hat was in his hand, his hair damp from the walk, his shirt clinging to the broad lines of his shoulders. His face was carved from stone, his dark eyes burning with a fire that sent a shiver down the spines of those who dared meet them. The Reverend faltered. Elias moved forward, slow and deliberate, his boots thudding against the floorboards like a drumbeat. He stopped beside Martha, reaching out without hesitation. His hand found hers, rough and sure, and Martha felt the world tilt around that single point of contact. Elias turned to face the congregation, his voice steady and deep. "I will not stand by while you slander the woman I love." Gasps rippled through the church. Mrs. Barrow clutched her husband's arm. Miss Simmons pressed a hand to her mouth as if to trap her own surprise. Elias's grip on Martha's hand tightened, a silent promise. "I see her," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Not through your eyes, clouded by hate and fear, but through my own. I see her strength, her kindness, her courage. I see her beauty, not in spite of what you scorn, but because of it." Martha blinked back tears, her heart beating so wildly she thought it might burst. "You judge her because you are small," Elias continued, his voice cutting through the thick air like a blade. "Because you cannot imagine a love that does not fit inside the narrow boxes you build around yourselves." He turned then, dropping to one knee before Martha, and for a moment the church was so silent that the creak of the rafters overhead sounded like thunder. From his pocket, Elias drew a simple silver band, the metal gleaming dull and true in the pale light. "Martha Mayfield," he said, voice low but carrying to every corner of the church, "if you'll have me, I would be proud to call you my wife." A sob broke from Mrs. Abernathy's throat, muffled quickly by her shawl. Martha stared at Elias, at the man kneeling before her, at the courage and tenderness written into every line of his face. She saw not a savior, not a rescuer, but a partner, an equal, someone who had chosen her not out of pity or duty but out of a deep, unwavering love. Her heart swelled until it was too big for her chest. She slid her hand into his, her voice steady as she said, "Yes." The church exploded into noise, some gasping, some murmuring, a few rising angrily to their feet. But Martha heard none of it. She heard only the roar of blood in her ears, the wild, exultant beat of her heart. Elias rose, slipping the ring onto her finger with a gentleness that stole the last breath from her lungs. His thumb brushed over her knuckles, anchoring her to the moment. They turned to face the congregation together. "If any man or woman here thinks to speak against us," Elias said, voice as hard as iron, "let them do so to my face." No one spoke. Not Reverend Holt, whose mouth worked soundlessly. Not Mrs. Barrow, who sat rigid as stone. Not Miss Simmons, who stared wide-eyed at the defiance standing so boldly before her. Slowly, like the turning of a tide, heads bowed, eyes dropped. The strength of their judgment crumbled under the weight of something stronger, the undeniable truth of what stood before them. Martha felt the air shift around her, felt the old chains of shame and doubt fall away. She was not broken. She was not a burden. She was a woman loved fiercely, openly, without apology. Elias squeezed her hand once more, and together they walked down the aisle, past the pews heavy with silent witnesses. Each step was a triumph, each breath a demarcation. Outside, the morning had cleared. The sun burned away the last wisps of mist, casting the world in bright, unforgiving light. But Martha did not flinch from it. She stood tall, her hand in Elias's, her heart wide open. The townsfolk spilled from the church behind them, uncertain, murmuring, but Martha barely noticed. The world had narrowed again to the man at her side, to the future stretching out before them like an endless road. Elias turned to her, his smile a rare, breathtaking thing. "Ready?" he asked. Martha nodded. More than ready. They walked through the town together, heads held high, leaving behind the smallness and bitterness of Dry Creek's judgment. They walked toward something new, something vast and bright and waiting. At the edge of town, Elias paused, pulling Martha gently into his arms. "You're not what they say," he murmured against her hair. "You never were." "And you," Martha whispered back, "are more than I ever dared hope for." They stood there, wrapped in each other, as the town behind them faded into memory. Love had found them, not loud and easy, but fierce and true, carved from trial and tempered by fire. It would not be easy. The world would still press against them, still try to wedge itself between their joined hands. But Martha knew now what she had only half believed before. They were strong enough. Together, they would weather every storm. Together, they would build a life out of the wreckage, brick by careful brick. Together, they would prove that love, once found, needs no one's permission to bloom. And somewhere, high above the cracked earth and stubborn fields, the sky stretched wide and endless and filled with light.